Did you? Yes. Good. We recorded now. Our guest tonight is Professor Kai Ambos. He is a professor in University of Göttingen in Germany. He is working in criminal and criminal procedure law and international criminal law and international public law. He is also judge in Kosovo Tribunal, and he is also consultant for Colombia Peace Talks, or I don't know how to say it. And he is also a director since April 2018, director of the Institute for Criminal Sciences in Göttingen. Now, we have a very, very actual topic tonight. It is about war in Ukraine, Russia against Ukraine, and Professor Ambos will give us information about that juristic or legal situation about this war. Yeah, the floor is yours, Professor.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks again for the invitation, Hakan Hakiri. After a long time, last time when we saw in Göttingen, I don't even remember, it must be years, maybe 10 years, you know, we are all getting older, and I see some other colleagues, Professor Ungvar and others who I know by name at least. I hope you can follow my talk. Of course, we do not have a lot of time. I mean, the topic is highly complex, and also the situation is quite clear for us. I mean, we know actually what is happening on the ground. So we have a factual situation which is quite clear, but there are still many legal questions which can be debated. And I prepared a little PowerPoint presentation with the main provision, the most important provisions in this context. And so I want to share it with you. I just try to share it, and then you tell me if you can see in a moment. Let's see, I just have to go to presentation, and then so now you should see the presentation. Yes. Ukraine International Criminal Law. Okay, great. So please, if there's anything you want to challenge me on, you can directly interrupt. I'm not at all, I rather do it like the Americans, you know, like the Anglo colleagues. So I'm very flexible, not the German professor reading a paper, but so I'm interested in your views. I gave this talk in different contexts. Yesterday, actually, I talked to Colombian colleagues about it in Spanish, and there were different views. So please feel free to interrupt me. And of course, after the presentation, also we can have a debate, and also you can, of course, have different views. It's obvious it's an academic framework, and we should be very transparent, and we should, of course, be open to any other views. So let's just start with the basic thing, which is the Charter of the United Nations, where we have a clear-cut provision which is applicable. Of course, you all know it, Article 2 of the Charter and Article 2, Paragraph 4. I highlighted in red the important parts of all the documents. I'll show you, because there's a lot of text, and so we do not have time to read everything, every word. No use of force, okay? Prohibition of the use of force, that's a clear-cut provision, actually quite relevant for Turkey if you think of the Syria situation and you know, the debate if Turkey violated this provision. And that's another debate, of course. But here we have a clear-cut violation of 2.4 of the Charter. Under which conditions could a state legitimately use force? Only under one condition, and that's the condition of self-defense. If there is no Security Council resolution which authorizes the use of force, as there is not in this case, the only way to use force is self-defense. And of course, to make the argument that there is a self-defense situation for Russia would mean that Ukraine has threatened Russia. So Ukraine has threatened to invade Russia, which, I mean, there are some arguments by Putin in this direction, but we can discuss them. But of course, factually, we all know 200,000 soldiers, Russian soldiers along the border, that was the situation. And there was, of course, no credible threat. That would be a suicidal mission for Ukraine, a small state of 35 million, 40 million people, to attack the biggest nation on the earth. Of course, there's no factual scenario which covers this. Rather, we have a situation where Russia invades Ukraine and Russia uses force and has no justification for it. Rather, the states, Ukraine itself, of course, has a right to self-defense, and the states who now side with Ukraine, including Turkey, as you well know, and we will see a statement of the Turkish representatives at the General Assembly when the famous United for Peace resolution was adopted a few days ago. These states invoke collective self-defense. That's important. He is collective self-defense. What we would, in criminal law, we could talk of Nothilfe, you know, so it's just you help your neighbor, you help the person who is attacked. Here, states can help a state which is attacked, and this help, of course, even covers military assistance. It would even cover a NATO involvement, which of course nobody wants, because we do not want an escalation of violence, and that's why NATO doesn't intervene. But legally speaking, you do not need to be a NATO member and trigger Article 5 of the NATO treaty to invoke self-defense. Ukraine and the president could rightly say, we are attacked and you should help us under the charter. So that's a legal argument which could be used, but we are speaking about military assistance. As you know, Germany has changed its policy for 40, 50 years and now provides weapons to Ukraine. That was a radical change by Germany and other states, Poland, of course, United Kingdom, United States. And this is clearly covered under Article 51. So that's the situation under the Charter. The situation is quite clear-cut. I think we had no situation so clear-cut after the German Nazi invasion of Poland in 1939. Actually, we have the second war of aggression now after the Second World War. The last war of aggression was the German war of aggression, you know, in Europe. Of course, the National Socialist war of aggression against Poland, France, Russia, and so on. And now we have a war of aggression, unfortunately, by Russia against Ukraine. So what is the reaction of the international institutional community talking about United Nations? What is a body who should react? Security Council. We had a draft resolution tabled by France, Germany, England, United Kingdom to actually condemn Russia's invasion and to use Chapter 7, i.e. to use countermeasures within the collective defense system of United Nations. This resolution, as you well know, has been vetoed by Russia being a permanent member, and therefore the resolution was not approved. Also, we had 11 states in favor of the resolution, only 3 abstentions. Who abstained? China, India, and United Arab Emirates. So just keep them in mind, these 3 states, because you will see it again. You will have a kind of rehearsing if you look at the General Assembly resolution. So this resolution was not adopted formally, since it is a substantive resolution, Chapter 7 resolution, and if one permanent member brings in a veto, the resolution cannot be adopted. But mind that China did not vote against the resolution, okay? China abstained, and that is the position of China right now. It's in the middle between, you know, yesterday we had a conference between Germany, France, and China on this, and the Chinese president, China tries to middle, you know, to fiddle around the situation, not to condemn Russia openly, but at the same time trying to calm down the situation and not helping openly, assisting openly Russia. So there is a kind of compromise position. Anyway, the resolution has not been adopted, but it's important to look at the resolution. Why? The resolution is actually preparing the General Assembly activity, the General Assembly resolution, which then has been adopted a few days later, and I will show you in a moment. So one thing, for example, is very important. There is this situation is not absolutely not new. We have the Minsk agreement. We have the whole Minsk framework. You know, Minsk is the capital of Belarus, which is party to the conflict because the attack was from Russia and Belarus, the attack on Ukraine. And you will see that Belarus also is part of the sanctions and part of the General Assembly resolution. So the Minsk agreement have been violated by Russia. But this is just a kind of secondary provision. I mean, what has been violated is a charter. So we don't need the Minsk agreements as kind of secondary agreements between states. But it's just important to keep that in mind. And there have been specific agreements between Russia, you know, this Normandy format with France, Germany, still with Angela Merkel, and Russia and Ukraine. And these specific agreements, which, for example, contained a comprehensive ceasefire as to the situation in eastern Ukraine, because we are talking here about a situation since end of 2013, and that's very relevant to see. So we are talking of a situation where you have a destabilizing situation in the east of Ukraine, in the so-called self-declared republics of the Donetsk region. And this has been, of course, has been addressed by the Helsinki group. It has been addressed by the Minsk Normandy format, and in different formats. And so, importantly, also the Security Council resolution referred to the Secretary General's call. This is very important in this situation. You know, very rarely, actually never, since the United Nations came into existence in 1945, you had such a clear statement by a Secretary General. The Secretary General is a Secretary General. I mean, he should be neutral. You know, he's actually Portuguese. It's Gutierrez from Portugal, but he was actually very outspoken. And you know that Russia has criticized very much the Secretary General, saying that he's actually losing and his neutrality. But it seemed to him, and it seems to the whole staff of the United Nations, if you go to the United Nations website, New York, Geneva, you will see that there is a clear-cut positioning of the United Nations against the use of force. So it's a very rare situation. I mean, in all the conflicts we have since 1945, we never had such a clear-cut taking of position of United Nations and here of the Secretary General. And that's why the Secretary General is also mentioned. The Secretary General's call to Russia, to Mr. Putin, stop this war, you know, stop this invasion. Also, the use of the word special military operation, that's maybe, if you want, the kind of George Orwell speak, you know, you talk of something which does not exist in law. I mean, this word doesn't exist. There is use of force, there is armed conflict, there is attack. We have clear-cut definitions in law. We have these words in law, but special military operation is like something very minor, you know. It's like, you know, you are going in a state with a kind of 100 soldiers and you know, like Eichmann, you know, you kidnap Eichmann and you bring it to Jerusalem. That's a kind of special military operation, or something what the United States does very often when they killed bin Laden. That's a special military operation. You have special forces going in and doing something. But this is a kind of what the international lawyers now call this new language, this kind of Orwellian speak to diminish actually what is happening, namely use of force, armed attack, coercion against another state, aggression. So importantly, then it's of course put in inverted commas. In all these United Nations resolutions, you will never see special military operation as an official term. Only in Russia Today, if you watch Russia Today, or if you read Russia television, you will see it without inverted commas, but not in the official documents. Now and then it's about territorial integrity. You talk about an aggression against Ukraine. You say you should immediately cease its use of force, refrain from any further unlawful threat, withdraw all of its military forces. The decision related to the status of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk is as such a violation of the non-intervention principle. You know, that's a thing we can discuss if you want. That's another issue. Reminding us of Kosovo, may be relevant also for Kurdish areas in the north of Turkey and Syria, you know, and Iraq. That's an interesting point. What about recognizing certain groups which have no statehood, you know, which do not amount to a state? And then clearly saying that Russia should reverse this decision. I mean, Mr. Putin, who said, if you remember, I recognize these two republics, and one day after I get a call and they tell me, please help me, you know, that was a kind of like a kind of film, you know. And then you of course talk about humanitarian assistance. This morning we had an interview with Mr. Maurer of the ICRC in the German Deutschlandfunk on the humanitarian situation. Humanitarian organizations like International Committee of the Red Cross, other organizations, Médecins Sans Frontières, they try to get access, they try to help the people to get out of the country or to help. We have 1.4 million refugees already, 1 million people being in Poland. You think of the situation for Turkey, you know, the refugees coming to Turkey from Syria. That's a similar situation, you know, when Turkey had to take so many refugees. And that's for the neighboring states, in this case, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, that's a highly challenging situation. Okay, that's the situation of the Security Council. We had no resolution. What happens in this situation? We have a situation where the Security Council doesn't do its job. That's clear. The Security Council is failing to maintain international peace. And we have seen this before in different scenarios, because we have the issue of the 5 permanent members, and the 5 permanent members may use the veto. So what can we do then? And that's an interesting development, because we didn't see this in other conflicts, and especially we didn't see it in the Crimea annexation. You remember when Crimea was annexed, the island, and this was actually taken lightly, you know, by the West. I mean, it was really taken lightly, and because people thought maybe, well, Putin is happy if he has Crimea, and nobody recognized Crimea, but it's of course controlled by Russia now, you know, and the independence of Crimea was a few days, and then there was this referendum, and then it's part of Russia. And we had the same situation. There was a Security Council resolution, Russia vetoed, and we had a General Assembly resolution. But here we have a different situation, because the Security Council may, if it is not able to act, make a procedural decision. And this procedural decision it can make without a veto. Okay, the veto cannot stop this decision of a permanent member. So the procedural decision was taken with the same majority to send this situation to the General Assembly, and the General Assembly should have an extraordinary session, emergency session. That's important here in this context, not an ordinary session. Because the General Assembly can, of course, under the Charter, give recommendations, can make sessions, can discuss about peace, and it does so. But it gives it much more authority if you have a situation where there is a specific emergency session. And that's what we know in international law as a famous Uniting for Peace resolution, which comes from 1950. You remember in the Korean situation, that was a situation when we had this famous policy of the empty chair under Stalin still. And then the General Assembly came in with this United for Peace. What's the idea? If the Security Council cannot help, cannot act, the General Assembly can, instead of the Security Council, take the position and make a decision. And that was what happened a few days ago. And we have a surprising clear result. If you see the result here, only 5 states against. And I show you here, of course, Turkey voted in favor of this resolution. And who voted against? I mean, it's really Belarus, of course, because Belarus, as you know, is an ally of Russia and participated in the invasion. The Democratic Republic of Korea, Eritrea, Syria, of course, Syria, because Syria only exists because of Russia. You can say Mr. Assad would maybe be in the ICC or in Germany in the court if we have actually Syrian cases, but he actually survived because of the Russian invasion. So these are the 5 states. Then it's more interesting to see the abstentions, because we have here some African states. That's interesting, like Zimbabwe or South Africa. You know, South Africa has a traditional relationship with Russia because Russia, Soviet Union, had a clear position against apartheid. So that's an historic relationship. Or you see Cuba, for example. You know, Cuba also a kind of historic relationship. The only ally Cuba had for a long time was Soviet Union. or you have the situation of Venezuela, which did not even appear. That's funny, you know, the Venezuelan delegate did not even appear, so they didn't vote at all. And Venezuela is also, maybe it was, you know, for Venezuela, it was too, I'm not sure. I mean, they were just not able to vote, abstain, and all of Latin America voted in favor, except Cuba and El Salvador. Who knows why? So you have a situation where the situation is quite clear. Nicaragua also, which is still supported by Russia, and there is heavy investment of China also. So that's quite interesting. If you look at these states, why they voted in a certain way. But if you compare this to Crimea, in the Crimea resolution, we had only 100 states in favor, 100, okay? And we had 60 to 70 abstentions. So the situation was not that clear. So clearly, the United Nations members in this case have a much more clear-cut position. 141 states voted in favor. And if you speak to some of these states who abstained, for example, South Africans, they, of course, are against this invasion, but they have this old, you know, this kind of old allegiance to the Soviet Union, and they just did not want to vote against the Russian Federation openly. But what then does the resolution say? And that's basically what we already have seen, and that's why I showed you the Security Council draft, because it's basically repeating emergency special session. This refers to the Uniting for Peace resolution of the 3rd of November 1950, so giving the special authority to the General Assembly, because the Security Council has been prevented from exercising its primary responsibility because it was blocked by the Russian veto, okay? That's why you send it to the General Assembly. Referring to all these principles, it's a quite didactic General Assembly resolution. You should use it, Ms. Palak, for your international law students, because it's very didactic. It brings you all these famous documents of the 50s, Friendly Relations Declaration. States should not use force. You know, we have Clausewitz, you know, there is no more continuation of politics by war. We should speak to each other. We should not use force. And you have all these important documents which are rehearsed here, which are invoked. And then we have the aggression definition of 74, which is a basis of the crime of aggression in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And of course, we refer to international peace. Again, special military operation is condemned, again, in inverted commas. No territorial acquisition shall be recognized as legal. Very important. Remember, the Crimea annexation has not been recognized legally, but de facto it's under Russian control, the Crimea. But, you know, the idea is from an unlawful invasion or unlawful act in international law, no lawful consequence. You can say it's like a fruit of the poisonous tree, like in procedure, you know, procedural law. It's a poisoned fruit, you know. So what you actually have, even if Russia totally controls Ukraine and occupies control, will decapitate the president of Ukraine, there will be no recognition. That's actually explicitly prohibited by the resolution. The grave concerns regarding the attacks on civilian targets, civilian objects, the scale of the attack, that's another important argument if we discuss about the Russian argument of preventing a genocide against ethnic Russians and, you know, kind of humanitarian intervention argument, genocide argument, which is now before the International Court of Justice brought by Ukraine, you know. Even if you accept this argument that Russia acted on behalf of these republics, this is absolutely disproportional, because then they should only have taken back this part of Ukraine and not invaded the whole country. So it's clearly beyond the necessary and proportional reaction. So even if you accept the argument that there is some basis in an argument that Russia was invited, you know, and actually acted on behalf of these republics, then they should just have stayed in the east of Ukraine, but not go through Kiev and Mariupol and take the whole country. Then the issue of nuclear forces, you have heard not only the activation of nuclear forces, also the attacks or the alleged attacks on nuclear power plants. You know, Chernobyl is in Ukraine. You know, Chernobyl, we all remember, we have suffered from it. I'm not sure if you saw it in Turkey, if you were affected, but in Germany, you have been affected by the Chernobyl accident before '89. And Chernobyl is still an operating nuclear plant. It's actually operating in Ukraine. The issue of food security or insecurity, you know, Ukraine is an important producer of grain, for example. And then on the dispositive part, commitment to territorial integrity of Ukraine, deplores in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation, demands that the Russian Federation immediately ceases its use of force and refrain from any other unlawful threat, should withdraw its military forces, no recognition of the decisions, or this, what we call the non-recognition of the recognition of Putin, you know, so clearly the position is that this was a violation of the territorial integrity. As you know, think of Turkey's situation. If someone would recognize Kurdish territories, Syria, for example, that would, of course, be an intervention in Turkish affairs. That would be a violation of Turkish sovereignty because it's part of Turkey. It's not a state, you know. And this is less organized and a smaller part in Ukraine. Immediately, unconditionally reverse the decision of recognition. Reference to Minsk, humanitarian assistance, and especially referring to Belarus, okay? Belarus as a co-author, if you want, the co-perpetrator in the war of aggression. And then the reference to international humanitarian law and of course, reminding us of the rules of international humanitarian law in this situation. Now, that's a situation which we have under public international law. So we have a quite clear-cut situation, and the Turkish representative made this crystal clear. This is a very clear declaration by the Turkish representative at the moment of the General Assembly resolution, especially referring to the illegal act of aggression against a founding member of the United Nations by a permanent member of the very organ entrusted with preserving peace and security. The ongoing military offensive against Ukraine blatantly violate the fundamental rules of international law. The international community cannot remain spectators. The current resolution emphasizes loudly and clearly that it stands against egregious violations of the independent sovereignty and territorial integrity of fellow member states. It is still not too late to go back to the negotiating table. A neighbor and friend of both the Russian and Ukrainian people, Turkey stands ready to support the peace process. So it's a very clear position of Turkey here. There is no misunderstanding. I mean, it's absolutely clear that Turkey sides and has voted in this sense with the 141 states. So what happens on the criminal law level? What do we have? I mean, we have, of course, as you know, the situation before the International Court of Justice, and we also have cases with regard to Ukraine in the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, various cases. That's another area. So we have this public international law, human rights fora, and now we have a situation under the ICC, which is quite interesting, because it's unprecedented and it's a historical situation. Let's just remind what is the situation of the jurisdiction of the competence of the court. The court has territorial competence. Basically, the court has competence jurisdiction over the territory of states parties. That is why the court has no jurisdiction over Turkey. Turkey is not a party to the ICC statute, as you know, but there are certain possibilities to create competence for non-state parties. And this is Article 12.3, which is relevant in this context, because Ukraine is not a state party either. Ukraine has not ratified the ICC statute, but such a state can, by a declaration, lodge with the registrar of the court, except the exercise of jurisdiction by the court with respect to the crime in question. And this has been done by Ukraine. That's very important. I only quote here the second letter of accepting the court jurisdiction by the foreign minister of Ukraine based on a parliamentary decision of the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament of Ukraine, adopting this resolution. And the important part of this letter, which was sent to the former registrar, Mr. von Hebel from Netherlands, from the ICC, is the part in red. The Ukraine accepts the jurisdiction of the court for the purpose of identifying, prosecuting, and judging the perpetrators and accomplices of acts committed in the territory of Ukraine. Okay, so it gives territorial jurisdiction to the ICC since 20 February 2014. Okay, since 20 February 2014, and this is a declaration made for an indefinite duration. I mean, you know, contrary to what you may think under Article 12, Para 3, it is not a limited declaration. States, and that's practice of the ICC. We had the same declaration by Palestine regarding Israel. States can, for the future, make such a declaration. And that means that the ICC has jurisdiction for any international crime committed on the territory of Ukraine since 20 February of 2014. And this is the reason, as you will see in a moment, if I show you the declaration of Mr. Khan, of the chief prosecutor of the ICC, why we have something going on already. It's not new. I mean, that is an old investigation which is going on. But how can the jurisdiction be exercised? So the trigger mechanisms, how do we actually get to the ICC? This is Article 13. Again, I have here highlighted in red the provision which is relevant in our case. But a Security Council referral, which we had in the case of Sudan and in the case of Libya, not so in the case of Syria, because of a Russian veto, okay, would have been possible, but of course in this situation, absolutely impossible that Russia would veto it. So it's out of the question. Otherwise, the prosecutor could act proprio motu, ex officio. The prosecutor is an independent prosecutor and he could also act in accordance with Article 15. But this is a much weaker position. I explain you in a moment. And therefore, it's much better for the prosecutor if states refer the situation to him or her. And this is a possibility in Article 13, letter A. And then it is explicitly developed in Article 14. So state parties may refer a situation to the prosecutor, and this will help the prosecutor to initiate directly an investigation. This has happened before with so-called self-referrals, for example, by Uganda, Democratic Republic of Congo. So they referred their own situation to the court. But also in the first collective referral was regarding Venezuela by Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Canada, some states of America. And this was the first collective referral, you know, situation of international crimes in Venezuela. Now, this has been now topped by this situation. That shows you again, this is such an unprecedented act of violence and aggression that we have reactions here you haven't seen before. And we do not talk about sanctions here. That would be even more. If we start talking about sanctions, it's even getting much deeper. But only about the law, I mean, international law here. That's the first time we have a referral of in total 39 states, okay? 39 states. Of course, Turkey cannot be within these states because Turkey is not a state party, okay? You must distinguish here. Only state parties can refer situations to the court. This was a letter of the United Kingdom ambassador in The Hague to the registrar, to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court of 2nd of March 2020, when he, on behalf of these states, which are named here, yes, you see all the European Union, other states, also United States cannot be part of this because it's not part of the statute. And previously, we had a referral by Lithuania, which is an old, as you know, old Balkan state, former Soviet Union, which was a first state, a small state. Imagine this, you know, this really neighbor state of Russia and under threat by Russia and highly afraid of Russian overreaction. And they were the first state. This small state of Lithuania on 1st of March, but then this followed these 38 states, and we have now the first collective referral of 39 states. That is an unprecedented referral. And what would have happened without this referral? That's important here, procedurally speaking. This is Article 15. If the prosecutor acts proprio motu, independently, he receives communications, for example, by victims. Actually, he receives thousands of communications, ICC communications. But then in para 3, if he thinks that there's a reasonable basis to proceed with an investigation, he has to submit it to the pretrial chamber. So he has to get an authorization by 3 judges. And that makes things complicated. At a very early stage, he cannot investigate, he cannot go on investigating, but he needs authorization by a chamber. And that's very, very important. We had this highly disputed decision, Israel-Palestine, highly disputed decision, Afghanistan, when the same situation occurred. And so the prosecutor is a very smart man. He's actually a barrister from London, Mr. Khan, and he, in his declaration, which I have here, the last declaration he made the 2nd of March, he actually said already in the first declaration, in the same statement, that was a previous declaration of 28th of February, I indicated that active investigations by my office would be significantly expedited if a state party were to refer the situation to my office. So this was in Germany, we would call ein Wink mit dem Zaunpfahl, So he actually said to the states, come on, refer the situation to me and give me more authority. And the first state who took this up was Lithuania, as you have seen, and then the other 38 states followed. So actually that was a suggestion by the prosecutor. 28th of February, the prosecutor said, think of referring the situation to me. A few days later, actually next day, the 28th of February. Next day is 1st of March. Lithuania refers, and then 2nd of March, you have the 38 states. Imagine this reaction. What we have seen here, only on this front, is an incredibly efficient reaction. You would never have expected the European Union react so fast. I mean, European Union normally is very slow, So they reacted. These states reacted very fast. It was, of course, coordinated. Like in this case, it was the British government who coordinated this in The Hague with the embassies. And so we have this referral. And then he says, today I can confirm the 2nd of March, 2 days later, after the 28th of February, I have received the referrals of these states. And these are the 39 states we already saw before. Switzerland, for example, which is neutral, as you know, and has also joined the sanctions, and which is, of course, very important because Switzerland is, in terms of banking finance, very important. And so you see it's these 39 states. And then he says, I have now competence from the 21st of November 2003, so not only from 2014, because we had the first declaration of Ukraine, which already gave him competence. And so he is investigating all crimes, war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide committed on the territory of Ukraine. And he says, my office has already found a reasonable basis to believe crimes within the jurisdiction of the court have been committed. We have a preliminary report on Ukraine by the predecessor of Mr. Khan, Fatou Bensouda, on crimes committed before the actual war, before the invasion in the east of Ukraine. And they already said there is a reasonable basis that war crimes have been committed, not only by Russia, also by Ukrainian forces, perhaps, and also by the independent republics, the forces which are acting there. And then he reminds us of the principle of complementarity. Of course, if Ukraine would make an investigation, but it's, of course, unable to do so under this situation, Russia would not be willing to do any investigation, and Belarus either. So in the end, complementarity would not intervene here. Support of states, parties, and the international community more broadly will be essential as we seek to meet the inherent challenges faced in the conduct of this investigation. I will therefore seek the partnership and contributions of all states in order to address our need for additional resources. across all situations. I repeat my call to all those engaged to stop hostilities. But here the thing is, and just that you understand this International Criminal Court issue, the International Criminal Court is a very weak organization. It's a very under-financed organization. It's under-resourced. It has not many personnel. It has not a big budget. And so if these kind of situations come, we had the same situation when the Security Council referred to the situation of Sudan or the situation of Libya. And these are investigations which are highly resource intensive. The only way for the prosecutor to act is if he gets additional contributions. And what we are doing right now in these days is that Germany and other states are sending people to The Hague, to the office to help. I mean, for example, we get prosecutors, policemen from the German Federal Police, and they are seconded by the German government. So, of course, this is all financed by the state parties. There is no money from the prosecutor for this because it's an additional investment. And basically, this is they are trying to help. And parallelly, you may have heard in the last days, we had started an investigation at the Federal Criminal Prosecutor, die Generalbundesanwaltschaft in Karlsruhe, on the basis of complaints by our former Justice Minister and former Interior Minister. So there are also national prosecutions now starting. So the situation is quite complex. So that's from my part, and I'm now open to any questions. Thank you very much.
Dear Professor Ambos, we thank you for your presentation. It was really very interesting for us, also for other Turkish participants. I want to thank you for taking your time to make such an extraordinary presentation for us. Wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I am very grateful. So we can pass to the discussion. Maybe Dr. Parlak can direct this section. Yeah, Parlak.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Ambos, for your wonderful presentation. I want to ask a question about international criminal law. In this year, January, a German court sentences a Syrian former intelligence officer to life in prison for crimes against humanity, committed in the Middle Eastern countries, civil war. 8 years ago, also in Germany, 2 Rwandan men accused of leading a rebel group in the Eastern Democratic Congo Republic, I remember that, were jailed for the war crimes. Are there any alternative ways like that in which Putin or the others could be brought to justice?
Yeah, I mean, these cases are cases based on the German Völkerstrafgesetzbuch, on our Code of International Criminal Law, which in paragraph 1 contains a provision on universal jurisdiction. Yeah, universal jurisdiction for war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity, but with a certain procedural restriction, namely that the person has to be in Germany. So we have to have a chance to arrest the person. So in the cases you mentioned, these persons lived in Germany. I mean, the Syrian, that was a case of Syrian, that was a high-level former intelligence officer of a very famous prison in Damascus, and he actually left the regime, and that was actually one of his defense points. He said, I'm a dissident now, and I cannot go back to Syria. And then he came to Germany as a refugee. And as you know, we have many Syrians in Germany, and so we have victims and perpetrators in Germany. Actually, the victims identified him. So it was together with an NGO from Berlin, European Center for Constitutional Rights, and then this case was brought to the Prosecutor General. And also this case of the FDLR people, from this Liberation Army from Congo, they also lived in Germany. The guy actually studied in Germany. He studied very close to Göttingen, and the other guy lived in Paris. So there was a parallel case at the ICC. So under the German law, you need that these persons are in Germany. And so now our investigation, which just started, is what we call in German ein Strukturermittlungsverfahren, ein it's a kind of structural investigation. So what you actually do, we have fought for this a long time. You know, I was part of the group more than 15 years ago when the German law was drafted. And our point was, even if we do not have a chance that this person may come to Germany, in the case of Putin or Lukashenko, you know, Belarus, we can still start in kind of evidence gathering in case that there is a point when this person will come, and then we have already evidence, or we work together in this international system. That's the same what we do with these investigative commissions. You may know that we have a Syrian Investigation Commission, which has been decided by the General Assembly, because here's the same situation. Russia vetoes a referral to the International Criminal Court regarding Syria. The case goes to the General Assembly. General Assembly sets up for the first time the so-called Syrian Investigation Commission. And these commissions do the same thing. They just look for evidence, you know. And the same commission, but now by the Human Rights Council, has been discussed last week regarding Ukraine. So what we do here is just, we try to find evidence for a possible prosecution at a later stage.
Thank you. I want to ask one more question. I read articles about this, and I want to ask to you. Some international lawyers have called for the creation of a dedicated international criminal tribunal to investigate Putin and his acolytes for the crime of aggression. Is it possible under the international criminal legislation?
Well, that's public international law. Actually, of course, the problem here is the following. Why has this been presented by any eminent international lawyers? For example, Dabo Akande from Oxford, a friend of mine. They are very important people behind this proposal. Why? We have no jurisdiction for aggression. You must understand one thing. That's a clear-cut war of aggression here. What we see here is a war of aggression we haven't seen since the Nazi war of aggression, okay? But we have no forum. We have no forum. The ICC is not competent because this aggressor state and the victim state must be state party, which is not the case. We will not get a Security Council referral. And under national law, for example, under the German law, we only have competence for aggression if German nationals participate in the aggression, or if the aggression is directed against Germany. So basically what we see is, we speak of aggression. You have seen it in the General Assembly resolution. Almost all international lawyers agree that this is aggression, because they are not just remaining in the east of Ukraine, but they are trying to take the whole country. But we can do nothing. We are totally powerless. We are totally helpless. So we see a war of aggression going on in the middle of Europe, yes, but there is no way to create accountability. And that's why these international lawyers say we need a special court. And the problem with this special court is, this special court, of course, would be a creation by states, a little bit like the Kosovo Tribunal, Kosovo Specialist Chambers, where I'm a judge. You know that Turkey is supporting this tribunal. That's very interesting. This is a tribunal supported. Of course, it was actually adopted by the General Assembly of Kosovo, and there is an agreement between European Union and Kosovo, but it's a kind of creation by states. And Ukraine, for example, could say, we accept an international court and we delegate our territorial jurisdiction to this court. But then the question is, which states will support this court? You will certainly have major states against this court: Russia, India, China, yes? And you know what will happen? Turkey, for example, is not clear what will Turkey say, because these are strategic decisions. You may, if you create this court, we had a discussion about Syria, Turkey some time ago when there was a discussion about a court about the Kurdish issue. So Turkey may, in this case, for example, say, no, that's not in our interest to create such a court, you know. So it's a very difficult dilemma. I'm not sure if I'm in favor of this, because it also, you know, we have an international criminal court. We have a court which is acting in The Hague and which has, of course, competence, as we have seen, for the other crimes. And why should we have another court for aggression? The problem is that also is a question of financing this court, you know. And in the end, if you create such a court, which is only kind of Western court, then you may reinforce this kind of division, which we already have, you know, between the West and, you know, this new Cold War scenario.
Thank you. I want to ask one more question because I think we have not too much time.
I think Mr. Kamis wants to ask a question too, you know. I see
okay.
Alexander Kamis. Yes, we can bring in other.
Raise your hands. Okay.
Wunderbar, dankeschön. So thank you very much. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm an architect, but I'm also an historian. And I'm going to make a quote here. Le leggi son, ma chi por mano delle Dante Alighieri. We have the laws, but whose hand is going to execute the laws? Eventually, that is, so it seems like the international community is looking at Poland, you know, 1939. I would suggest to look closer at the Anschluss, which was 1 year before, because the propaganda is the same. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer, the same propaganda is being mentioned today, you know. It's an Anschluss, annexation.
Yes, yes.
More in the speech, in the propaganda of the Russian regime. But we are, I mean, unless the West does come in with planes or there's not much we can do. Now, so my question is about, should we look further back in history? Because I have one analogy here, which is the invasion of the Huns in the Gothic domain, which was in that area. What happened, and that's why I'm saying this, because what happened in that time is that the Goths migrated across the Danube in what was then the Roman Empire. So what is happening now with these refugees is very similar to what happened in that time, and which did not happen with the Anschluss or the Poland. You know, we didn't have that kind of phenomenon. So I wonder if what is going on is done on purpose to push that migration in order to create destabilization, and what could be done legally in this sense.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we can take more questions. I saw Mr. Dursun, Selman Dursun. I just take a further question, please.
Selman Bey.
We cannot hear you. I think you are muted.
Mikrofon kapalı.
Yes,
okay.
Now
It's okay. Selman Dursun, Istanbul University. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambos, for your informative presentation. Vielen Dank. At the beginning of your speech, if I didn't misunderstand, you made a comparison between the situation of Russian invasion of Ukraine and Turkey's position in North Syria in terms of Article 2 of United Nations Charter. However, as we know, these situations are totally different. Turkey's aim is to create a safe zone, not invasion or annexation of Syria. Could you please more clarify your comparison? Thank you very much.
Do we collect more questions?
Yes.
Mr. Emin Guliyev, can we have your question, please?
Maybe I can see you also. If you could activate your video, that would be nice.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much, dear organizers and Mr. Ambrose. Very interesting information about the International Criminal Court. I would like to ask you one question about collective responsibility. Collective responsibility in the meaning of responsibilities of legal entities, not only persons, prominent persons, the persons who have a political power or power to have many decisions in aggressive war. For example, the president, vice president, or members of government, but also a government as a collective person. Or you know that, and you also mentioned that in the Russian Federations, there are many subjects, not only Mr. Putin, but also many subjects who take decision on these aggressive actions. His government, Security Council, and State Duma, Parliament, and other. How about their responsibility? How about their condemnation as using of as a participation in the act of aggression? Is there any legal mechanism in the International Criminal Court to do so, not only for persons, but also legal entities, government bodies, to condemn them for their crimes? Is there any mechanisms? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I may just react to these three comments, and then we can have further questions if you like. Thank you very much to all your questions. I think the issue of the refugees, Mr. Kamis, is a big issue. And of course, if I understood you correctly, you make this point that that may be a strategic way to destabilize and the whole European Union. I mean, Turkey is part of also this issue of destabilization by refugees from Syria. I mean, you know this much better than we in Germany. I mean, we have it in a different way, but we are in the middle of Europe. But this issue, I'm not sure, I haven't heard this argument, but I'm not sure if Mr. Putin and the Kremlin really had this strategic thinking in this way. I rather thought always Putin, as he does with Georgia and as he did with Ukraine since 2013, could easily and has destabilized this country. Imagine this situation where your biggest neighbor, the biggest country in the world is your neighbor and is helping a kind of movement in the border region, sending Russian troops, Russian trainers, bringing them back, bringing them forth, and you will never have peace. You will never have peace. And that's actually the strategy they did with South Ossetia, with Georgia, the situation where you just have these countries like kidnapped, in a way you can say, if I move my soldiers a bit further, I will just decapitate your government, which is different with Ukraine because it's a bigger country than Georgia. But as you know, that Georgia has not supported directly the sanctions because Georgia is a neighbor of Russia and Georgia is very, very fearful. So Georgia, on the one hand, voted in favor of the General Assembly resolution, but there were protests in Georgia, in the capital, against the position of the government not directly supporting Ukraine. But that's just a question of power politics. I mean, what can you do against Russia if Russia moves? And so people rather saw that maybe Mr. Putin has made a bad calculation error here, and that is that you cannot overrun Ukraine. Remember, you as a historian, Ukraine had a very fiercely resistance against Nazi occupation. The Ukrainian resistance is famous in his efficiency against the Nazi occupation. They were very hard fighters, they are very hard fighters. And just a symbolic thing that Mr. Klitschko is a major of Kiev, the former box champion. I mean, that's just a symbolic thing, but this shows this kind of symbolic strength. Also, the president, you may have seen this Servant of the People, this show he did, this film, which is now in Arte Television. I recommend you to see this. Arte Television, the German-French television, has now brought it with subtitles in German and French. The thing is in Russian. And the guy played this role against corruption in Ukraine. And then he got president with the same name, Servant of the People. He didn't expect it. And now he's president, and now he's becoming kind of hero, kind of martyr, and represents the resistance of the Ukrainian people. So I think it would have been much better strategically for Russia to do this, to continue with this kind of destabilizing in the border area with Georgia and others. And in fact, Russia has got away with the Crim annexation. I mean, the West has never reacted in a very decisive way. And Germany is a good example. If you follow Germany, the German politicians, including the Social Democratic Party, we don't need to mention Mr. Schröder. It's such a disgusting situation. You know that Schröder got a doctor honoris causa from the University of Göttingen, but not from the law faculty, actually from science. And now they are discussing, among many, many things, to take away the doctor honoris causa of Schröder, the old chancellor, because he's still not retiring from Gazprom and from all these positions, and he's still defending Mr. Putin. But that was a position of the Social Democratic Party for years. Also the position of our former coalition government that many people said we cannot be dependent on Russian gas and Russian oil. And now we are in a situation where we cannot really do the hardest thing what Biden did 2 days ago, namely to stop imports from Russia. And that would really hurt Russia. We pay $1 billion euros a day to finance this war, okay? Of course, if we stopped this import, we would have a problem with our coal in Germany because we would have no more heating. But the thing is that the whole German policy has been very naive with Russia. But now with this invasion, you can see all these politicians from the left, our left party, you know, the Linke, and also the Social Democrats, which now turn into kind of, everybody is now condemning Putin. From the left to the right, there is nobody actually defending Putin. So it's really a change, a sea change. So yes, but it's, of course, we don't know what happens, but the refugee situation is certainly a problem. Mr. Dursum, well, I didn't want to compare this, but thanks for your question. I just wanted to make the point that always if you use of force, as you use of force when Turkey goes to Syria, then you have the issue of 2.4 of the Charter. You may still say, I'm justified under Article 51. But remember, this is a thin line. That's a problem. I mean, we have this situation. Think of all these other Western violations of international law. We are haunted by this now. You know, we have actually made an unlawful invasion in Iraq, okay, under Bush, as you remember. This was an unlawful invasion. Germany did not participate at that moment. You remember the French foreign minister when he had his fight in the Security Council with Colin Powell, who actually spoke of this mass weapons of mass destruction which were never found. So that was clearly an unlawful invasion. The Kosovo recognition is highly doubtful. And actually, Russia made submissions at the ICJ when we had the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice regarding Kosovo. And Russia mentioned this remedial secession, a bit the argument they made today. Of course, they changed their position because in Kosovo, Russia was against the recognition. As you know, until today, Russia doesn't recognize Kosovo, and that's the old alliance with Serbia, and you have the situation how Serbia reacts. But of course, the West is not consistent in his position, in his policy, in these areas, and therefore, many of my friends, I myself, we are criticizing the West all the time, United States, and we think the West is, of course, using double standards. But at any rate, I mean, if your neighbor is killing someone, that doesn't give you the right to kill him, no? Okay. So if someone is acting unlawful, like United States or let's say United Kingdom, that doesn't mean that Russia can do the same. So that would mean we are in a chaotic situation. And I think still that such a straightforward violation has never happened. And that brings me also to Mr. Kamis's point. I think it's really like the Anschluss. It's really a situation like what the Nazis did in 1939 and the whole propaganda. Today, I heard an interview with some people still in Russia. You can, if you are still a younger person, you can still get information. Even if Facebook is out, YouTube is out, you can still get information if you just don't watch Russian television, and you can be informed. But the whole propaganda is like the Nazi propaganda, you know, when the Nazis said, well, this is just that they asked for help and this kind of flag operations, like, you know, the Polish invasion in 1939, the Nazis said we were attacked. You know this famous Hitler speech when Hitler said, now it's enough. They have attacked us twice. This was all fake. This was Nazi propaganda. And the same happens now. And that is so shameful. The only difference is that today it's much more difficult because we have reporters on the ground, BBC, CNN, you have even Deutsche Welle still on the ground. So you have very courageous reporters which report from there or humanitarian organizations. So we know that things are different. Now, Mr. Guliev's question of collective responsibility, there is no collective responsibility under the ICC statute. The ICC statute only addresses natural persons. So there would be no way to, let's say, for example, take the Duma, the Russian Duma, into responsibility, or Gazprom, if you want. I mean, we do not have, under the ICC statute, responsibility of legal entities. What would be interesting maybe is think of the American law or of law of most states that we accept responsibility of legal persons, criminal responsibility, not so in Germany, but in many other states. And so you may, for example, make an argument that a company which finances such a war, I mean, that must be, of course, demonstrated, like Gazprom, which, because it's a state company, it may be complicit. As, again, we have the German Nazi comparison. Think of IG Farben, the whole German industry who use slave labor. You know, you have this famous word in the Nuremberg trials, after the Wehrmacht, directly after the Wehrmacht came IG Farben and Krupp, and they then used the slave labor, and they also financed this war. So you need, of course, to have these wars, you need companies supporting it. And that brings us, of course, to the need of criminal responsibility, but it's not under the ICC statute.
So thank you, sir. Thank you very much for the questions and answers. Is there any other question?
Yeah. Can I ask?
Yes, please.
Dear Professor, thank you so much for your evaluations. My question is a little bit hypothetical, but I will try to ask. I believe at the moment we see the economic sanctions are quite compelling for Russia. They are really struggling about it. However, since the Security Council is blocked, another legal way to end the conflict seems quite challenging. And the conflict persists. There is a use against violations persists also because crime of aggression is a use against violation. So if the conflict persists and as a doctrine for ending the violation of use against, how would you what's your view about the conduct doctrine of humanitarian intervention? Is this another way, or just ethical dilemma about this conflict? Thank you so much.
Well, I think as I said when we talked about Article 51 of the Charter, in this situation, legally speaking, you would not need humanitarian intervention, which is a highly vague concept, and as you know, has been also used by the West. I mean, in the war on Serbia, when Joschka Fischer, our Green Minister, tried to justify the NATO intervention on behalf of Kosovo, And so the humanitarian intervention is also highly disputed, as you know. And there are states like China who are absolutely against it. I think Turkey, I don't know the Turkish position, but I would think that Turkey also is against this concept. And so it's because it's not very precise, and we wouldn't need it legally speaking, because we have if you say that there is a war of aggression going on, there is a crime of aggression, act of aggression, as has been actually established by the General Assembly, then you would be able to act under Article 51. And that's another thing which German politicians do not really understand. They always refer to the NATO treaty. You know that we are all part of NATO. Turkey is also part of NATO. We have this Article 5 or Article 4. But even beyond NATO, I mean, the Charter is our constitution, as a world community. And if you have an attack on a state not being part of NATO, still other states could intervene. That's a parallel to criminal law. I mean, it's like you would, if on the street, if you attacked Albal on the street and your friend would defend you, for example, your friend is with you and attacks the attacker, and he's in his right under Turkish criminal law because he would act under notice. And the same is in international law. It's the same idea. So what we are doing now is we are acting on behalf of Ukraine. And there are so many provisions. We have this on law of state responsibility. You think of the ILC draft on state responsibility, this whole idea of countermeasures, because this question is sometimes asked. Of course, we are aware that sanctions are very hard for the normal population. That's the issue of sanctions. We know this. We know this from Iran. We know this from many, many situations, that sanctions affect normal people. But in this case, what is the alternative? I mean, we try to use targeted sanctions. We have a special group in the European Union who tries to find the assets of Russian oligarchs who are not in Russia. They are here very close to where I live, in Baden-Baden, for example. Russians buy all over the place, like the Chinese, villa, they have yachts, they are in the Côte d'Azur, and, they are in Switzerland. And then the problem is we had this case of a yacht in the north of Germany, and the Russian oligarch says, it's not my property. And so they have straw men, you don't know sometimes who is actually the owner of this yacht. And then the question is, how can you actually execute these sanctions? But the idea of these sanctions is that they are targeted. But of course, if even Coca-Cola goes out, McDonald's closes, Netflix closes, all these shops, every Russian is affected. Of course, that's even the Russians who are critical of Putin, and that's very sad. But what can you do? I mean, the only way is on a non-military level. The only way is try to squeeze Russia economically and get to Mr. Putin and that his economic advisors and the oligarchs, like, you know, that all these oligarchs who have these football clubs, you know, the Schalke 04, if you know German football, they have been financed by Gazprom. They have this trigger with Gazprom, and they now have cut the relationship. And Abramovich, who is an owner of an English Manchester United, he was taken out by Manchester. So you have all these consequences. So the oligarchs are also affected, you know, and nobody of these people who are actually individually targeted, Mr. Lavrov, Putin, Mr. Peskin, the Russian defense minister, the spokesperson of the Duma, they all are on the sanction list. Nobody can travel. They cannot travel to Istanbul. Turkey would have to execute this. I mean, these are sanctions where even states which are not directly sanctioning, they are part of this. And if Turkey voted in the General Assembly so clearly, and we have seen the statement of Turkey. So if there was even China, we have a discussion, even China, who is not in favor of sanctions, we are discussing here that China would not undermine these sanctions, you know. For example, we have the SWIFT sanctions, you know, that Russian banks are affected by this. And so I think we never have seen such a package of sanctions. And we are discussing right now in the European Union. Yesterday, Ms. von der Leyen gave an interview here about even cutting the oil and gas imports right now. So, I mean, that means for the German population, and this has to be said, for example, we have to have a car-free Sunday. You know, we had this 20 years ago, you remember, in Germany. That's nice. I have a bicycle. I like it. I think we don't need cars anyway. So we can do it. And then we will do something for the climate. But of course, we would have to reduce enormously our energy consumption. And we would have to find, of course, we may have to go back to our carbon Kohlekraftwerke, you know, to what we actually wanted to get out. So there is a price to pay. But I think we have to we have to show solidarity with Ukraine. This is a situation which is like David against Goliath. This is a situation where a small country is attacked by the biggest country with one of the biggest armies of the world, and which is the biggest country anyway. So I wonder, I've read a tweet by some comedian saying the biggest country of the world wants to be even bigger. I mean, come on, why is it not enough? I mean, they are big enough in terms of extension. They are already the biggest country. And why not modernize the Russian economy? So that's such a strange thing. And that's why these comparisons to Hitler, this kind of, you know, is it the kind of crazy thing, instead of trying to modernize the Russian economy? That's what for years we are saying. This economy is just based on natural resources, on gas and oil, and it's not a modern economy. Anyway, so maybe there are no explanations. I think there's another question, Hakan.
Yeah, we are running out of time, but I think we can take the last question, if you allow me.
Yes.
Asım Bey.
Hello, Professor Ambos. I would like to say welcome to you. I was your student at Völkerstrafrecht last semester.
And I remember, yes.
My question is not relevant with International Criminal Court, but still I want to ask. Yesterday, Belgium's Flanders region suspended study grants for Russian students. We read this on local news in Brussels. My question is, can we say that's a violation of International Convention on Elimination of all forms of discrimination, or just it's a legal sanction? And could Russia apply for cert about these violations? Well, I want to just know your opinion on this. Okay. Thank you so much.
We can still, Hakan, if you want, take the last questions and then I answer everything once.
There are two more questions. Yes. Shall I take them?
Yes, please, please.
Yeah, Zeynep Hanımlar.
Hi, good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for this great presentation again. My question is actually, I was like, I had some concerns because I wanted to ask a question regarding.
Could you activate your camera, please?
I'm not like in a perfect position at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, that's the problem with Zoom. We all know this. That's why we suffer from Zoom. Okay. Yeah. Okay, but then ask your question. Okay.
Yeah, sorry for this inconvenient situation, first of all. So my question is from the human rights perspective of this particular, let's say, war or the illegal force. But I was like, I had some concerns whether this is relevant to your presentation or not. But because of the last question, I wanted to ask the particular issue regarding the sanctions over individuals being imposed by certain states. So the last question was about the education and the students, but there are some sportmen or sportwomen, they're not allowed to attend certain competitions, let's say, or games, and there are other like areas that states are like trying to impose some sanctions on individuals in order to show their kind of the reaction to the attack to Ukraine by Russia. So from the human rights perspective and considering the European Convention on Human Rights, do you think that this could be a violation of human rights, especially given the situations of Russian people from other countries, not in Russia, but from the other countries? And thank you so much again.
Thank you for the question. And Zeynep Hanım, the other one.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, I am also not able to open my camera, so sorry about that. And thank you for Ambos for the great lecture. It was so delightful and insightful. And I would like to ask that in the case of criminal responsibility of Putin in the future, hypothetically, and what will the responsibility of him is it a military commander responsibility or a superior responsibility, given that I think he is a commander-in-chief in his country? So what will be a way to address the issue? So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for this last question, especially by Alba and Burku. I think that's a big issue. I understand your point. Yesterday, when I had this conference with Colombian colleagues, the same question came by Colombians on the human rights level, on the individual level. And I think we have to be careful not to punish people who are maybe even against Putin, That's an issue with this double effect of sanctions always, I have friends in Russia, we have colleagues in Russia, as you may have, as professors. We are working together with Russians and there are great people in Russia. That's not the issue. And many of them are very critical. Each day, if you know German, you go to Deutschland Radio or Deutsche Welle, and you hear Russians speaking very critically, being still in Moscow, And so then I would have to see the concrete measure, but I would certainly be against measures which affect Russians outside Russia. I mean, that would be too much. I mean, Russians which are private citizens. I mean, maybe that's another thing. If you are part of the embassy and of the state structure, like you have seen this Dublin situation where someone with a lorry, ran into the embassy, and these are other persons, but private persons or Russian students or even Russian colleagues. But the issue is, what can we do collectively? I mean, we have all this research organization. I tell you from a research perspective, the Volkswagen Foundation, for example, which many of you may know, Volkswagen Stiftung, has put up a program of, I think, 10 million euros to give scholarships to Ukrainian colleagues. So this is really there, this money. So if some Ukrainian colleague wants to come to a German university and you receive him, he gets a scholarship, 1,400 euros a month. That's not a lot, as you know, but it's something. But of course, the same organizations will cut off any relationship with Russia right now on the institutional level, because how can you differentiate. I mean, you know, you have, for example, the Academy of Sciences of Russia, or with research organizations, the German DAAD, you know, the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, the Humboldt Foundation. So what can they do right now if you are in a situation where you have sanctions on the level of the European Union? You are bound not to have institutional contacts. Why the companies on a private level have decided, Volkswagen or Starbucks or McDonald's, you know, to go out, and this all affects Russian normal citizens, and that's just a dilemma. But what is the alternative? I mean, we can try to be very targeted in terms of sanctions, and that's what we try to do. Of course, we have sanctions list where Putin and others are named, individualized. But on the other hand, if you have general sanctions like taking out SWIFT, about the companies, then you will see in the shops, that's what the situation right now, that people don't get certain consumer goods, and that's just a consequence. I think that's not a thing which may be unlawful, because we are still under the cover of countermeasures. I mean, we have a situation where there is an unlawful invasion, where there is a crime of aggression. We have a General Assembly resolution. We have all the analysis you want to have, and then we are in our right to make countermeasures, reprisals, countermeasures under international law. And as I said, we could even have military countermeasures going further than just imposing sanctions. So I think that's just the unfortunate other side of the coin. But that's also because we hope that. And that's maybe, and that brings me to also to Alba's and the last question, Ms. Karatas, the regime should crumble from within. I mean, we know that we cannot overthrow such a regime by a military intervention. We couldn't even overthrow the Iraqi regime, you know, so the consequence was terrible. So in the end, you better don't do these things. The only way of Afghanistan, think of Afghanistan. So the only way is to help the civil society. The only way is to try to help a movement which can perhaps have enough force, enough momentum, you know, to strike against the regime. But of course, this was all prepared. The Russians are very clever people. I mean, you know, from the perspective of Russia, the last 10 years are a success story. You know, we have to be very self-critical. The Russians, Mr. Lavrov, for me, is a representative of a highly experienced Metternich, Talleyrand type foreign minister who eats all these American foreign ministers in terms of experience and cleverness. And the Russians have got away with everything. They are destabilizing Georgia. They are destabilizing the Balkan Republic. They are actually annexing the Crimea. And now they have just gone a step too far. But they have thought that maybe the West will not react in uniformity. But in this situation, I think we have no other choice. And I can tell you, you know, you have heard Mr. Zelensky these days in the House of Commons yesterday. He is criticizing NATO because we do not impose a no-fly zone. I mean, legally we could do this, but that would mean war. Then we are party to the conflict. And then Russia, of course, has a case to counter-strike. I mean, you know that I have discussed this in terms of weapons assistance. This is discussed in just security by American scholars. When are you actually turning into a conflict party? And that's highly disputable. But if you are actually enforcing a no-fly zone, you are actually participating in the conflict. And that would mean that NATO airplanes could be shot down by Russian airplanes. That would be within the reaction, the countermeasures of Russia, if we would go so far. And that is the position of Zelensky. Zelensky wants more, you know, and he says, as you have heard him, I mean, we are the first and then you will be second. I mean, he will not stop in Ukraine. I mean, that's another thing which we can, of course, hypothetically, what will happen after Ukraine. But so the situation is very difficult to find the right balance. And, you know, I can tell you, I'm not member of any political party. I'm totally independent, but that's the first time maybe where I can live with my country, where I'm happy with the reaction, because they are it's a very consistent reaction, but it's not a military reaction. And the worst thing what could happen is, even if Zelensky wants it, and we have to understand them, they want military assistance because they are just overwhelmed by the Russian superior military force. And so, of course, they want that we intervene and the NATO intervenes. But if we did that, we may have a war in Europe, which may affect Turkey too. So that's not an option. But it's very hard. If you speak to Ukrainian people, they will not, it's difficult for them to accept because they are in a fight for survival. Imagine this situation. I said yesterday in Colombia, imagine United States would invade your country. That's the situation you have. Colombia is a country which is bigger than Ukraine, has 45 million people, but United States would invade, no chance. Militarily, you have no chance. And the Colombian army is much better than the Ukrainian army. And imagine the Ukrainians, we just discussed it now in the blogs, that there are so many foreign fighters coming in. You know, they have this defense league, and we have people from Germany. I'm not sure if from Turkey also people come in, but we have more than 10,000 foreign fighters. They are part of this national alliance. There's another issue here with international humanitarian law. And so Ukraine, there is so much solidarity with Ukraine, and people take their decisions. I mean, the Ukrainians take the decisions to stay, you know, they bring the men, bring the family, the children and the wife to the border, and then they go back to fight. And others from outside, you know, take up their arms and try to fight. I think there is a general feeling of unjust and just in this situation, a rare situation, While Mr. Dursun, of course, you cannot compare to Syria, Turkey. I would never compare this because it's not so clear cut. You see, here you have a clear cut situation. I mean, every reasonable person, he is not a victim of Russian propaganda, must take sides. I cannot understand how a state cannot take sides here, you know. And we have a situation where, you know, we have our problems between European Union, Turkey. We have a problem with Poland, Hungary in the European Union, but all states have united here. You know, all these states have united. The Polish, who are very difficult in terms of refugees, are the country which, with the most open arms, take the Ukrainians, you know. And the Eastern country, as you know, Hungary, you know, which is a big problem within the European Union in terms of the distribution of refugees, is very open now. So this has united the European Union. This has even united the European Union, the NATO, within also with Turkey, you know. And so I think there is, while it's such an injustice that as also the situation that the biggest country of the world attacks such a small country where your feeling of justice, you know, is really affected, you know, you think that's impossible and you must take sides. I've actually, with my daughter, we have done a flag of Ukraine and put it on our window. That's just symbolic. What can you do? That's why I accepted Hakan's invitation. I normally don't accept this kind of invitations, but we are so emotionalized right now that I think if they invite me in half an hour, I give an interview to the Greek television. I only accept this because I want to spread the message. There are still people out there who discuss this. This is something legal from the Russian side. It's impossible. I mean, we have to put this narrative straight here, you know. And I think that's our responsibility also for the young generation to make clear what is happening here is an unforgivable act of war and is an unforgivable act of aggression, which only can be compared. And I tell you as a German, with a national socialist aggression, you know. And by the way, just another point, how absurd is it to say we denazify this government when the president is Jewish, okay? Mr. Zelensky is a Jew. And this government is less, this country has fewer Nazis than my country right now, I tell you. We have more neo-Nazis, unfortunately, in this country, you know, than in Ukraine. How can Mr. Putin dare to say, I want to take out a Nazi government, a neo-Nazi? It's so absurd, but people still believe it. You get from Telegram groups messages, the whole Russian propaganda, you are not safe. You get messages where they say the people in Donetsk are celebrating, they are now liberated by the Russians from the Nazi attacks from Kiev. I mean, that's so absurd. And you tell this to a German. I mean, actually, we had the privilege to have had the Nazis, you know. So now this kind of Nazi argument against a guy who is a Jew and who actually has very close relationship with Israel, as you know. That's why Mr. Bennett is actually negotiating, you know, in this situation. So it's so absurd that I think rarely we had a situation, Mr. Kamitz, you may confirm it as a historian, rarely we had such a clear-cut situation where justice and injustice is clear, no?
So thank you very much, Professor Ambos, for taking your time for this great presentation. And I would also like to thank the other participants from Azerbaijan, Germany, and Austria. So maybe Dr. Parak, you can close the conference. Thank you very much for everybody.
Dear Professor, thank you for your evaluation and the wonderful presentation. Today, we talk about the Ukrainian and Russian, not a war, Russian invasion to Ukraine. Thank you, Professor. Have a good evening to our participants. See you our other conference.
Thank you very much. Have a good time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.